Great. I want to thank Maycal for that kind introduction. And she may comment on how much I'm doing. I would note that she is a mother of four and getting her PhD right now. So that's pretty heroic in its own right. So I was asked this morning to talk about the demographic changes facing both the United States and the Twin Cities area. I was also asked to talk about the relationship between equity and economic growth. I was then asked to talk about leadership challenges that folks might be facing, particularly in LISC, and also asked to talk about the balance between mobility strategies and move-in strategies, and to do this in a way, these are my notes, that would include an appeal to both the local audience and folks from around the nation. I was then asked that if I could, in the course of the talk, discuss the housing recovery. Is it real? And also, what is the particular value of your property individually? This morning they added that I should talk about the fiscal shutdown and the likelihood of it being resolved, and maybe whether or not Ted Cruz, who at least to me resembles the Wicked Witch of the West, might officially declare, "I'm melting, I'm melting." And bring an end to the crisis. Finally, added just on the way up, I can't believe Michael brought this up. He wanted me to comment on whether or not there's a likelihood that the Nobel Peace Prize, which is soon to be awarded, might go to Miley Cyrus for the inter-community understanding she's brought by introducing twerking to a larger audience. And for those of you who don't know what I'm talking about, you're way too old. So that's a lot to do in what we in Spanish call a keynotito, a small keynote. So what I'm going to do instead is talk a little bit about some of the particular changes and challenges that face at least some of these issues around demographic change, around thinking about a different relationship between equity and economic growth, and then also thinking a little bit about what that means for leadership moving forward. So that's what the talk will be about. I always like to say before I get started, some of you who've heard me speak know that I'll say this frequently, I actually have my voice may break while I'm talking. It's not that I'm an emotional being with you, although this is truly an emotional experience. I have a speech disorder called spasmodic dysphonia. It's what Diane Reeves, who's on NPR from DC, has, where the voice breaks. And I like to tell people, don't worry, it gets treated once a month with Botox, which is literally true, because that's how we treat everything in Los Angeles. So, so for some of you, the happiest day of the year may be your birthday or Christmas morning or the first night of Hanukkah or whatever your holiday might be. For those of us who are demographers, the happiest day is the day that the census releases its data. Because it's just so joyful. It brings so much interesting understanding. And when the census released its data a little bit after 2010, one of the things that we found looking at the nation as a whole was that the growth rate for Latinos in the United States between 2000 and 2010 was 43%. The growth rate for Asians in the same period was 43%. A remarkable coincidence. I think we were coordinating, Mikau. The growth rate for African Americans, about 11%. The growth rate for non-Hispanic whites, 1%. So those who'd been following the numbers were not actually as surprised as the commentators on the night of the election. Do you remember that? I mean, some of you might have been going, wow, this is really interesting. I'm going, I am so mad because I've been talking about this for a year, you know. So, I mean, they were like, oh my God, we've become like a different nation, right? So demographic change is very dramatic, 43% to 1%. And what's interesting, or perhaps most interesting, at least to someone like me about that, is that while most people think that what's driving that demographic change is immigration, that's no longer true. Immigration into the country is slowing down. It's one of the reasons why immigration reform is queued up, particularly by businesses. They're worried about workers in the future. Immigration from Asia is now outpacing immigration from Latin America, and net migration from Mexico is zero. Partly because of a shift in the wage structure. It used to be that wages in the United States were 7 to 1 compared to Mexico. Now it's 4 to 1, primarily because Mexico's doing better. But also because the fertility rates in Mexico have changed dramatically, meaning that in the past, about 30 years ago, over the course of her lifetime, a woman in Mexico would have 5 children. That fertility rate is now down to 2.3. The fertility rate in the United States is 1.7. As those two come together, the demographic push factors are no longer there. So what's driving that is really the births to immigrant parents of a second generation. Now, what does that look like in Minnesota? In Minnesota, you're outpacing the nation, 2% growth in whites, but you still have a significant growth rate for African Americans, very high growth rates from a low base for Latinos and for Asian Pacifics. In Minneapolis, St. Paul, about the same as Minnesota as a whole, looking at what's going on. But what's interesting here is looking at, in the Minneapolis metro, the blue bars are people of color, the yellow bars are non-Hispanic whites, and this is the number of the folks. If you look at the 1980s, the 1990s, and the aughts, what you'll notice is in the 1980s was that whites were contributing the bulk of your population growth. That's completely reversed in the aughts. That is the 2000 to 2010 period, where about 250,000 in the net population growth is coming from people of color, about 65,000 from whites. So that's a big change for a place like Minneapolis, St. Paul, the metropolitan area, and certainly for the state. This shows you the share of growth in the United States. In the 1980s, about a third of the population growth was coming from non-Hispanic whites. For the United States as a whole, in the aughts, 2000 to 2010, only about 8%, with 56% of the growth, net growth, in the U.S. population coming from Latinos, which means that abarrotes will be said the right way in the future. So, bienvenidos a la familia. We're claiming you now. So this is what it looks like in Minnesota, so this is pretty dramatic actually. 62% of your population growth was coming from whites in the 1980s, only about 18% in the aughts. That is a really dramatic difference, and a very sizable share of the increase coming from both Asians and Latinos, as well as from African Americans. So again, what's primarily driving us now is the youth population. So this shows you what's happened to the number of young folks in the United States between 2000 and 2010. So the number of young whites in the United States in that time period, those under the age of 18, actually fell by 4.3 million. Now that does not mean that 4.3 million young white people died. We would have noticed that. It would have been reported on Fox News. It would have been blamed on the president. So, and don't worry, I'll make fun of Rachel Maddow later. So what it means is that more people are moving into 19 and 20 than are moving into 1 and 2. So the net number of whites falls. The net number of African Americans, young African Americans, fell by 250,000. The number of, and so although some of that has to do with folks redesignating themselves as multiracial and moving into the other category there, the number of young Latinos in the country grew by 4.8 million. and the number of Asian Pacific Islanders grew by about 800,000 young folks. So that's the future of the country, and it's even the future of Minnesota. So this shows you the growth rates for the youth population for the U.S. on the left, Minnesota on the right, negative 10% growth for non-Hispanic white youth in the United States as a whole, negative 11% in Minnesota. With, again, the growth in young folks coming increasingly from, you still have a very healthy increase in the African American youth population, but more, an even higher increase in terms of percent change in the Latino population, pretty high for the API population as well. So we're looking at a different America, we're looking at a very different Minnesota, even a different Minneapolis-St. Paul. And that's why when people take a look at this, they understand that what's going on in the country as a whole is that by the year 2043, probably, the majority of people will be a so-called majority-minority nation. Or as I like to think of it, all minority all the time. We'll all be minority. Which actually is interesting because it means that the skills that minority Americans develop about negotiation, about bridge building, about compromise, are skills that will be ones needed increasingly as we move into the future. By the year 2029, 2030, the majority of the workforce will be people of color. Not the majority of entrants, the majority of the workforce will be people of color. 2019, 2020, majority of youth are people of color. Last year was the first year the majority of births were to people of color. So it's a very different nation that we're moving to. And how we deal with that moving forward will be one of the incredible challenges and one of the things that groups like LISC and others can contribute to. Now, we've been through this before. I know people who are not from my home state don't like us to say this, but California is America fast forward. The demographic change in California between 1980 and 2000 is the demographic change the U.S. will go through between 2000 and 2050. So we went through that very rapidly. In fact, we're stabilizing in a very interesting way. The only metropolitan region, large metro region in the United States in the last 10 years, meaning big metros, 100 biggest metros, so Baltimore and Minneapolis, St. Paul, and Chicago, and Atlanta, and Denver, et cetera. The only large metro region that did not see an increase in the number of Hispanic children? Los Angeles, yeah. Because we're stabilizing. It's an older immigrant population, older Latino population. Birth rates are going down. The whites who were going to leave have left. So we're stabilizing in terms of a population. But we do know that this change is difficult. It was difficult in California. And I recall actually the day that we became majority-minority. Demographers were saying that this was the day, December 15th, 1999. And you know how they do that? They go, the 300 millionth baby was born today. His name is Jose. How did you know that, right? So I kept getting phone calls from reporters all day long. They're going, we're majority-minority, we're majority-minority, majority-minority. What's it mean? What's it mean? What's it mean? They sounded nervous. So finally I said, I don't know. But we're having a salsa party at my house tonight to celebrate. In the spirit of the new California, everyone's invited. They just need to learn a new step. Like, how many of you have been salsa dancing? And how many of you took that class right before so you didn't embarrass yourself? Okay, so we need to learn a new step about who these communities are, what it means to lead between and across different communities, what does it mean to build coalitions in a new setting. And Minnesota is not going to be removed from those changes. So Minnesota will still, by the year 2050, be 71% white according to the projections. Minneapolis, St. Paul, a little bit less so, but these two will be an area that will be experiencing demographic change. Let me just jump over those. So this is something which helps you understand what's going to be going on both here and then in the rest of the country as well. Because when people see that demographic change, they somehow imagine that it's all actually just going to happen in California. Like California will become 150% minority, right? Super minorities walking the landscape, right? But what this shows you is a map of the United States. This is from work we've been doing with PolicyLink. And the map is pretty easy to interpret. The browner the county, the browner the county. So the darkest shade is greater than 50% people of color. The shade in between is 40 to 50% people of color. Just like that's a tipping point in neighborhoods, it seems to be in counties as well when you look at it over time. And this is 1980. So in 1980, the United States looked like most people still think it is, which is that it's sort of the black belt of the South heading up to DC, the borderlands of Texas with Mexico, the Native American and Hispanic areas of New Mexico and Arizona. Interesting look at California, how light California was. Los Angeles was not yet majority minority. The only majority minority county was Imperial County, bordering Mexico. This is what the country looked like in 1990, 2000. Look at the change in California going on in particular. And then in 2010, you can see the change beginning to spread. This is what it looks like in 2020 going forward, 2030, and 2040. So change going on in many different places in the country. And the places where it's not occurring actually tend to be either more lightly populated or the industrial areas of the Midwest, which have not been as vital, so not attracting quite as many people. So this diversity is coming to a neighborhood near you, and it's coming a little bit quicker than most people think. One of the really interesting aspects of this, and you can see it a little bit in this, Twin Cities area, but you see it even more dramatically elsewhere, is that where diversity is occurring most rapidly is America's suburbs. So it is America's suburbs, which used to be much whiter than America on average, which now actually look like America in terms of their demographics. And you can see this by looking a little bit at the Minneapolis-St. Paul area, where you could see that the areas that were majority people of color and near majority people of color, the yellow shade there is 30 to 40% people of color, were just in the two main central cities in 1980. This is what it looks like in 2010. So spreading beyond central city boundaries into some of your adjoining central cities like Bloomington, which are cities, but in some ways, sort of entering suburbs as well. And that's happening all over the United States. And what's interesting about that, the Brookings Institution has been focusing in on this in particular, not so much of the demographic change as on the rise in concentrated poverty. What's interesting about America's suburbs is that they tend to have very low social services infrastructure because they're not used to these populations. They tend to have very low civic infrastructure because people often move to suburbs to escape political life and city life. And they tend to have very weak community organizing infrastructure, which is how disadvantaged communities raise their voices in the political process to make sure that attention is paid to them. So this is an arena of work for LISC, for community organizers, for so many others to think about what needs to be done, and not just in our central cities, but in America's suburbs as well. So this just shows you another set of maps on Minneapolis-St. Paul. This is in 1980, and you could see the dots that are sort of blue and, green and yellow and red are Black and Latino and Asian Pacific Islander. Not too many of those dots, and most of them confined to the two main central cities. When you move to 2010, big spread. And you notice this here, but you actually notice it in so many other parts of the country. I don't know how many of you, it's a weird thing to be struck by, but do you remember the Aurora tragedy? And I was struck by the horror of it, but I was also struck by something else. When I lived in Colorado for a little while, it was one of those things. I was not a great college student. It's amazing that I have this job. I dropped out of college twice, right? One time when I dropped out, I drove to Colorado and was a carpenter, you know. I mean, it was the 1970s, forgive me, right? So, but I mean, Aurora, Colorado, that was like an all-white suburb, right? And I don't know whether you noticed, but very few of those kids coming out of that theater were either white or with a group of other kids that were all white, right? And if you look at the maps, Aurora's become this incredibly diverse suburb of Denver. That is happening all over America in our suburbs. So, those are some statistics. Were those interesting? Okay. This is the most interesting statistic. If there's no other statistic you remember from what I talk about today, remember this, particularly because there's a quiz afterwards. It's the age structure. In the United States as a whole, the median age for non-Hispanic whites, half older, half younger, is 42. The median age for Asians is about 35. The median age for African Americans, 32, Native Americans, 30. The Pacific Islanders, a little bit younger, but around 29. The median age for Latinos, 27. 42, 27, 15 years. It's a generation gap. And it helps to explain two things. One is it helps to explain our demographic change. Because when you're 27, you're in prime family formation age. When you're 42, you think you're in prime family formation age. I'm not questioning your particular judgment, but the other thing it explains is some of our politics. The state, for example, with the largest generation gap, the whitest old, the brownest young, Arizona. And think about the way the politics have played out there around immigration reform, around ethnic studies in the schools, and even just around investment. Because many of you may remember that famous Tea Party sign, "Keep your government hands off my Medicare." Remember that? People laugh because they went, reasonably enough, Medicare is a government program. But that's not really what that sign meant. What that sign meant was lift up the drawbridge just as a new generation is arriving, right? Make sure we protect Medicare and Social Security. Make sure we starve investment in education, job training, et cetera. And that generational conflict is playing out in our national politics right now. And it's certainly playing out in many of our local areas. If you look at the states that have the biggest generation gap, they have the lowest level of education spending per capita on students. If you look at the states with the biggest generation gap, they've got the lowest level of capital outlays on investments for the future for the state. We are not going to repair that by changing the demography. We're going to have to repair it by changing the disconnection between generations, between communities, between the future and the past. And that is going to require that we move, and this will get us a little signal where we're heading toward the end, that we move from transactions, from deal making, to transformations, to really developing a deep understanding of what's going on. So all of this is taking place along the, can we say bad things about the city now that the mayor's gone? Oh, sorry. All of this is taking place against the backdrop of growing inequality in the United States. This is a graph from colleagues at UC Berkeley and elsewhere. And the blue line is the share of income going to the top 1% in the United States. You'll notice two things here. One is that the share of income going to the top 1% peaks in this graph in 1928 and in 2007. 1 year before the Great Depression, 1 year before the Great Recession, for reasons that are actually telling that I'll get to in a minute. But you can also see from that despite the share of the 1% dropping during the recession, it's kind of creeping back up. And what's been interesting is that, in fact, the red line is that going to the top 1 to 5%, the green line is going to the top 5 to 10%. What's interesting about that is you can see there's really two different stories of inequality that are going on in the United States. One is what's going on with the top 1%, which has a lot to do with tax policy, CEO compensation, things like that. The share of income going to the top 1 to 5 and 5 to 10, that's basically the upper middle class. Those are returns to education, globalization, the technology. And we confuse our discussions of inequality when we kind of mush those two things together. We do have a problem around the increasing premium to education, which explains why I make more than my dad did, who was a janitor. But it doesn't explain why CEOs make $35 million in the year that they drove their company into a tank, right, to the ditch. So we've got two different problems, but this problem of inequality is particularly problematic because if you think about a new generation coming online into a society that's increasingly unequal and in which we're shortchanging the resources for that new generation to be more productive, we're looking at an America that will not work economically moving forward. And what that means is that there's an argument for dealing with inequality, racial inequity, et cetera, that is a business case kind of argument about preparing for the future. You can see where we're at in Minnesota by looking at the poverty rates for whites, blacks, Latinos, Asian Pacific Islanders, and looking at the big gap between the African American and Latino poverty rates on the one hand compared to the white poverty rates on the other. This is what it looks like for the Minneapolis Metro, still a very big gap. Huge gaps in terms of educational attainment, in particular both the African American, but much higher for the Latino population and the API population here, because while there's this kind of national model minority myth around Asian Americans, you have a population that's got more refugees, more Southeast Asians that have faced difficult circumstances, so a lot of folks who have not finished high school, still a lot of college attainment in that Asian Pacific Island population, but API population, but it's a very bifurcated population. But if you think about this educational inequality rolling forward, what it means is that the current inequality we've got may be something that will be continue to increase in the future unless we get creative and do something about it. And one of the reasons why we need to do something about it is because increasingly, while the old kind of notion has been that inequality is somehow good for economic growth, that's the sort of logic behind trickle-down, which is that if you give enough money to wealthy people, make sure they're doing well, they will have the right incentives, they will make the right kind of savings and investment choices. There's been an interesting body of research emerging from the developing world over the last 30 years, which basically shows that those countries that are more equal actually grow more rapidly over time. The argument being that those countries that are more equal are making more investments in basic education, that they tend to have less social conflicts, particularly around property rights. And what's interesting is that this international research has begun to seep its way into the United States as well. And so a number of us, myself included, have been looking at the relationship between inequality at the metropolitan level and economic growth at the metropolitan level. And for example, what we found in one study is that per capita income in our US metro areas, it's a function of things you would expect, like education and concentration of manufacturing and what your previous income was. But it turns out that those areas that are more unequal in terms of the gap between city and suburb, that are more unequal in terms of their income distribution, that are more segregated in terms of communities or have more concentrated poverty, actually do not grow rapidly over time. Now I know, you're looking at me, you're saying, I don't know. That's some leftist professor from California. In fact, he's from the University of Southern California. They don't even have a football coach right now. If you've been following it, I like to tell people that there's a job opening there. So You don't need to believe me. You can believe that well-known left-leaning organization, the Cleveland Federal Reserve, which did a study of 120 mid-sized regions, much the size of Cleveland, and they found that some of the usual suspects they think predict economic growth do predict economic growth, skilled workforce, quality of life, industrial decline, but much to their surprise, they found that income inequality, racial exclusion, the concentration of poverty were all significant drags on economic growth. And this suggests that we should be making these part of our economic growth package as well. Now, we've been looking at this as well. This isn't a picture of me doing research. And what we've been doing, much of which is, by the way, encapsulated in a book called Just Growth. I wanted to thank you for mentioning. My understanding is that LISC is buying a copy for everyone here. Good idea. It's a really great book. You should get it on Amazon.com. I don't know. I'm surprised it didn't win the literature prize this year. And for those of you who are not readers, it's about to be made into a major motion picture in which I will be portrayed by Antonio Banderas. But what we've done partly as an outgrowth of that research is to try to take a look. The IMF just did a study. They're also a well-known left-leaning organization. They did a study of countries, and they tried to take a look at growth spells, how long growth lasts, because if growth is sustained over time, investors feel more confident, they make more investments, people stay more attached to the labor force. It's a good thing to have growth that's rapid, but it's better if it's steady, strong, but steady, so that people can count on it moving forward. Volatile regions in the long run don't do that well. So they looked at growth spells for countries, and they found that income inequality was the single most significant predictor of growth spells lasting. So we just finished a study that's going to be published, in which we looked at a variety of different factors looking at metropolitan regions in the United States. The one that had the biggest impact on whether or not a growth spell was sustained over time was the initial level of inequality. In fact, what we found out was not only were levels of inequality connected with the length of growth spell, residential segregation and political fragmentation were highly associated with shortening growth spells, with having more unstable growth over time. So there's a different kind of message that needs to be put out there about how underinvestment in each other makes us less competitive as a nation. Social tensions about what growth will look like make it less possible for us to cohere and to thrive. And to me, that's also the story of the national crisis we've been through. If you think about what happened in the United States, we became so unequal that one group of people was forced to speculate with their excess wealth, while another group of people was so strained financially that they were forced to borrow either to maintain their standard of living or to buy that one last house before the American dream disappeared on them. That inequality got churned through a deregulated market, so that for the wealthy there were credit default swaps and crazy derivatives, and for poor working and middle class people there were subprime loans. And we were so disconnected as a nation that when the first people to lose their homes were Black and Latino homeowners in places like Fontana and Orlando and God knows where, Las Vegas, people said, that can't happen to me. We were disconnected, deregulated, and unequal. In the first few years of the crisis, we talked about re-regulating. We've barely done that. Occupy Wall Street raised the issue of inequality, but we've done very little about it. But fundamentally, what's there is disconnection, of not seeing each other. And when we don't see each other, we don't recognize our common fates. We don't see how it is that inequality is damaging to economic growth, damaging to our democracy, corrosive to who we are as a nation. And so we've been working on that issue, and it is a challenge for all of us. I'm going to bring this to a conclusion. It is a challenge for all of us to think about these things, making the business case about why equity is good for growth, recognizing for those of us who are more equity proponents that not everything that's equitable will promote growth, so we need to be looking for the sweet spots in between and looking at the ways that we can put things together to make this happen. But I do want to conclude. So, what have I said today? That's how I end my lectures, and it's not a lecture. I just want to say just a couple things. One is that we need, as we move forward, to stress over and over again, and believe it deeply, that equity and inclusion are not add-ons. They're foundations for what we do. If we accept the argument that this is something we only do in good times, or we only do because it makes our hearts feel good, we're missing the fact that if we don't make these critical investments now, we'll continue to have so much social separation, we won't be able to cohere in a strategy, we'll be underinvesting in the kids who will be our future. Equity and inclusion are foundations, they're not afterthoughts. In doing that, we need to talk about race, to be sure. And if you think about the way that I tried to lift up race, I mean, it was constantly front and center, because it's really what's, in some sense, worrying some people about the future. But, you know, and for others, it's a welcoming future. But it's a difficult conversation, because nobody in America wants to talk about race, right? White people don't want to talk about it because they're afraid they'll say the wrong thing. People of color don't want to talk about it because we don't want it to be the only prism through which our individuality is seen. So everybody's uncomfortable. So get comfortable, right? Because it's happening, it's our reality. One way to get comfortable, make sure the conversation is open and welcoming. Make sure that people are allowed to make mistakes. I mean, I hope you think I was funny, but part of the humor was to make that easier as we talk about those changes. You know, we try to invite people to conversations that are so serious nobody wants to come, right? Instead of trying to make it a spot of learning, of warmth, of acceptance. And in doing that, we need to talk about bridging generations and geographies as a way of getting at this notion of bridging around race as well. We also need to focus on not just on transactions, but on transformations, not just on deal making, but on heart changing, on making sure that people recognize what the future is. And we need finally to understand something really key that's missing in DC right now, which is that collaboration, getting along, is principled conflict, right? I mean, people, when they think about collaboration, tend to think about like that ride in Disneyland, It's a Small World After All, where all the children are singing. Are your collaborations like that? I mean, but you know, if you're collaborating with people you already agree with, like, that's like not that interesting, right? You should be collaborating with people with whom you have conflicts, but you've got some principles you share, and you've got some principles about how you will conflict. That you will conflict with honor, with integrity, with respect, with a willingness to come back the other day, the next day to talk about more. And that's certainly what's missing in Washington. What's missing in Washington is a notion of a new kind of leadership, the leadership that comes with recognizing that we are changing. I used to direct a program called the Summer Institute Social Change Across Borders when I was at UC Santa Cruz, which brought together activists from Latin America with activists from Latino communities in the United States to talk about bridging transnationally. This was in the 90s, before transnationalism was hip. And at the end of one of those institutes, an organizer from Sinaloa, Mexico, an organizer of campesinos or farm workers named Victor Quintana, said, you know, there's only two kind of leaders in this world. Leaders who like the game of chess and leaders who like the jigsaw puzzle. And like you, we were looking at him going, what the hell are you talking about? And he said, well, you know, in chess, there's only two colors, usually black or white. In the jigsaw puzzle, there are many different colors, and indeed a single piece can be multi-hued. In chess, some pieces are far more powerful than others. You are really bummed out when you lose your queen, particularly to a pawn. In the jigsaw puzzle, every piece is important. Because you know that sense of frustration when you get to the end and like one or two are missing, and you know it's your kids that took them. In chess, you literally move ahead by knocking somebody off their territory. You gentrify them. In the jigsaw puzzle, you make progress by fitting the pieces together so seamlessly that you don't know where one ends and another begins. In chess, the object is to win. In the jigsaw puzzle, the object is to complete the tapestry. We've been playing way too much chess and not enough jigsaw puzzle. We're doing it in DC, to be sure. We're often doing it when we pit place-based strategies against people-based strategies instead of figuring out how they jigsaw together. We're doing it when we pit city against suburb, and when we pit generation against generation. And if we are to steer our way to one and a better America, we've got to learn a different kind of leadership. Thank you.